Hey guys, Chris Dorry here. Today is a big thank you for getting me to 700 subscribers and helping me reach the first of my goals. I'm going to be completing a AFL Fantasy and Supercoach Keepers video based on the 2020 AFL Draft, covering my rankings from 1 through to 50. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy and let's get stuck in. So what I've got here is my suggested draft order. So this is applicable for both AFL Fantasy and Supercoach. And then what I've got here next to it is my AFL Draft Power Rankings from 2020. So this column isn't so much applicable for, I guess you could say, the scoring perspective, because guys like Jamara, you've got Logan McDonald, well, they're key forwards, so realistically they're not going to be the greatest of scorers from a Supercoach or AFL Fantasy perspective. But what this column really represents is basically my projection of, I guess you could say, quality of career. So, and I've also done some color coding here to, I guess, help you out from almost like a tier list perspective, and I've done this for both columns. So, and basically the way to interpret it is the lighter the color, the higher, I guess, the tier, you could say. And I've also got a projected best position column. So really what I'm looking at here is basically for AFL purposes, where do I think they're going to be playing their football? So, and I've in previous videos covered my AFL Draft Power Rankings, so I won't be covering that here, but you can see it here just in this column, just I guess to have a bit of a feel and to give you a bit of perspective in terms of, I guess you could say, career projection. But then here obviously we've got for Supercoach and AFL Fantasy purposes the order that I would be picking players personally. So to get us started, so my number one pick would be, if I had pick one for the purposes of a Supercoach or Fantasy draft, I would be picking Will Phillips at number one. So to compare him at the same age, he was basically doing what Matt Rowell was, really as an underager. So and really at the same age as Matt Rowell, maybe he was achieving slightly better numbers, but of course with no football last year, he's not going to be having the same sort of first season as Matt Rowell had when he was obviously up and going and playing great footy. So, and this is a word of caution with this whole draft class. I'm not necessarily seeing the upside that I would in a lot of other drafts. One reason for that is we've got a lot of talls, I guess, early in the draft, and a lot of them will be among those better players. But then I'm also seeing, and then you've also got, I guess you could say, you've got a lot of Victorians as well, where they weren't playing any footy last year. So missing that year of development, I think that's really going to hurt a lot of the Victorians, certainly short term, but even over the long term, I think what that will mean in sort of, I guess, reality is something like a Will Phillips. Well, he's not going to be as good as a Matt Rowell. Maybe if the season gone ahead, maybe that might be a bit more of a conversation, but realistically, I don't think we'll be getting a Will Phillips in that sort of tier of a Matt Rowell to really give perspective as to exactly where these guys fit in relation to other good established players and other young players in the competition. So yeah, Phillips would be my top guy. I would next be looking at a Finlay McRae. So although he's got forward eligibility this year, I believe he'll be losing that right away. So that wouldn't be part of the reason to be selecting him this year. But he's someone where he can play inside or outside as a mid. So, and his best footy will be as an inside mid, I believe, as with his brother. And to compare him to his brother, so he's actually a lot more advanced at the same age compared to Jack. So that's something to be mindful of. Jack really only came good in the second half of his draft year, whereas Finlay, well, he was already playing really good footy as an underager. So that's something to be mindful of. With a Finlay, he's actually been playing a lot of footy more across half forward for Oakley, but for AFL purposes, he's definitely a mid. So, and where Finlay differs to Jack, so is about, say, 5 centimetres shorter, thereabouts, maybe 6 or 7, but I think it'll be more like 5 once he's fully grown. But then I guess on the other side of things, well, Finlay, he's more advanced for the same age, but then he's also a much better user of the footy on both sides by foot. So I guess they're the pros and cons as to which way it goes. Who's going to be the better player? I think clearly Jack will be the better player, or is the better player, and will remain so. But Finlay, I think, does have the upside to be something I don't know, heading towards that direction. He's got a near identical game, has the same sort of evasion. He's got the ball winning capabilities, though he hasn't really had the midfield opportunity. But this is sort of, I guess, over the course of their career, I would be looking at Finlay as someone who can be obviously a very high scorer. So he's someone I'd have very high in a draft. And then next I've got a Tom Powell. So he's someone where he averaged 35 disposals in the SA under 18s this year. So yeah, he's an absolute ball magnet. So does he have the upside of a Phillips or McRae? Yeah, possibly. And I think really as scorers, and I've got all three of these guys in the same tier, there's not much separation. So yeah, so I'd be okay with any of those top three picks, and I'd really be comfortable with any of these guys. So yeah, whoever's there I'd take, and I'd be more than happy. Say if I had pick one, I'd be happy to move down to pick three and get whether it's a McRae, a Powell. So that would be what I'd be looking at. And really early draft, like I don't know the rules behind these draft leagues, but let's say you can trade pick one for one of the better young players, whether it's a Matt Rowell, whether it's a Sam Walsh. I'd be doing the trade. I don't see any of these guys having quite that level of scoring upside. Possibly they may make it, but I wouldn't be betting on it yet. I would like some more evidence, and I'd like to see them at AFL level first before I give them that sort of credit. So that would be, I guess, my word of caution. And if there's some sort of trading component to a keepers league, well, I would be mindful of that to sort of, I guess, give these guys the right level of value and perspective. So to move on to the next tier below, so I'm looking at an Elijah Hollins. So he's someone where he can play both forward and mid. So he's someone that I would possibly have him a few spots lower potentially, but I think he's got a good chance of retaining forward eligibility going forward. So and if he plays midfield, he can find enough of the ball. He's not the sort of accumulator of these top three, but Elijah Hollins can find a fair bit of the ball. Coming off the major injury, look, that's a factor. He's someone who was actually a very early bloomer, so that's another element of caution and why I didn't quite have him inside that top three in my own power rankings there. But certainly in terms of impact per possession, that's sort of his game, where he's someone where damaging kick provides that run, but then he also has the ball winning components. So he's one of the most exciting players from the draft, and yeah, I'd be looking at him as someone who has good scoring capabilities, but I'd be saying he plays both forward and midfield. So I think he'll be that really dual position player for most, if not all, of his career, because he's so damaging forward of center, and probably really from this draft class, I'd say the most damaging forward of center. So yeah, that's why I like Hollins probably as the top guy amongst this group. And then moving on from there, so we've got a Braden Campbell. And look, with a Campbell, I wouldn't say he's necessarily a high volume accumulator, but if he's someone who's going to play in defence, he's going to take the kickouts and really, I guess, be that primary rebounder from defence for Sydney eventually after, say, a Jake Lloyd sort of finishes. Well, I think Braden Campbell's got that sort of upside. If he's to be played as a midfielder or forward, my personal belief is that he's not worth anywhere near this high. But yeah, if he's to remain in defence, I would be picking him here. I think based on that sort of, I guess, valuation, knowing that you're going to need defenders for your team, I would be willing to take Campbell at this spot. So next up, we've got Sam Berry. So out of, I guess, this group here, this particular tier, I would say Sam Berry has the highest scoring upside. And he has an immediate game, and I'd say really all these guys have immediate games. Hollins we might not see much of this year, but with a Berry, he's someone where I think he'll be an excellent midfielder. So, and in terms of scoring, I would say probably slightly below this top tier, but not by a lot. And I think his scoring will be fairly well suited, particularly to Supercoach, because he's got that contested side of his game, but then he's a high volume tackler, so he'll do great in fantasy as well. So, but yeah, given, I guess, the dual position components to a Hollins and a Campbell, given I don't think Berry would score too much higher, I think the relative valuation for me would be I would take a Hollins and a Campbell just before. So just to give that all perspective. And then moving on from there, so we've got a Lockie Jones. So he's someone where he was playing at Sandful League level last year. So he was playing against men. He can play round one if Port Adelaide offer him that opportunity. And I think he'll be terrific and one of the best in terms of immediacy of impact in this draft. So in terms of scoring capabilities, he's someone who actually really in the finals series in the Sandful really kicked into another gear. So here's someone where if you've got a Supercoach team in particular, because he's got a, I guess, really strong contested side of his game, I think he's probably more suited to that format rather than fantasy. But he's someone where he could either be a defender or an inside midfielder long term. He's great in both spots and he really gives you those options as someone where he's got that strength and power, but he's also got really the explosiveness, long penetrating kick. He's a really damaging player, so he could really be anything, and in either of those positions for that matter. So he'll be an interesting one to track over the long term. If he's a midfielder, don't quite know how he'd go as an accumulator relative to some of the others. He'll be below these guys for accumulation. I'd say behind a Berry for accumulation and for scoring. But yeah, and in defence, I'd say, look, I don't think he'd necessarily be, I guess, taking as many kickouts as maybe a Campbell might in his prime. But yeah, Jones is someone where absolutely he's got X factor, but he'll win such a high proportion contested that for particularly Supercoach, if he's in the midfield, he'll be very relevant. And even in defence, look, as long as you're not sort of putting him in a lockdown role. I know in the Sandful at league level, he played a lot as sort of a lockdown defender, but he did get some opportunities to provide some drive from defence. So I'd be looking for him to provide a bit more of that into the future. So, and I think he will. I don't think that'll be much of an issue. And then next we've got a Heath Chapman. So if we're to compare a Jones to a Chapman as specifically defenders, I would say for AFL fantasy purposes, I would pick Chapman over Jones. Just being, I guess, more that Grant Birchall-esque type, where I guess he's that tall rebounder from defence, and I guess he'll probably find a little bit more of it, maybe take a few more easy marks relative to a Jones, whereas Jones is more contested, so I'd say he's more the Supercoach pick of those guys. But with a Chapman, well, he's not that sort of, I guess, necessarily midfielder at this point that Jones is. Maybe Chapman could push into the midfield into the future, so that's something not to fully discount, but certainly at this stage he plays his best footy in defence, and that's where he's, I guess, that established player. And with Chapman as well, we could see him this year. Really, I guess this whole group here that I'm highlighting now, they can all play this year and potentially all become regulars. With a Hollands, I'd say, look, maybe that's later in the season, maybe he gets those sort of chances to establish himself, but I wouldn't be saying right away given, I guess, the severity of the injuries coming off. So moving on to the next tier down, so Luke Pedlar. So he was someone who was a bit of a surprise for some people to see go so early. But yeah, he's definitely got game and is someone where he's got real power to him. So strong contested side of his game, and then as a forward, he can do some really nice things too. So strong lad, explosive, high volume contested. There's a lot to like. So where his best position will be, I think he'll be really, you'll have him splitting time between midfield and forward. I think he'll probably, because he's so damaging in both spots, I think we'll be sort of seeing quite a bit of both. So yeah, that's something, he's someone to definitely watch for. But in terms of scoring, look, I have him behind these guys, but I guess it's more so based on, he's had injuries, a bit less exposure, so for me, he's just a little bit below based on slightly higher risk factor, but I think Pedlar will be another really good footballer too. All going well. So then you've got a Jackson Haitley. So he's someone where he went in previous years to GWS, and he was someone where, of course, he was delisted, wanted to join Adelaide, did so during the pre-season draft. So I've really got him here, I guess, as a point of perspective, I suppose. So yeah, and he's someone where he'll be a very high volume accumulator ball winner for Adelaide. I'd be expecting him to play a pretty prominent midfield role, really, from this year going forward. So yeah, I think he's got some scoring upside, and yeah, he'll be a really solid pick if he hasn't been picked up in your leagues. So yeah, definitely someone to watch. And look, he can play inside mid, outside mid. He's best as an inside mid. You could even play him off halfback if you wanted to, but yeah, he's someone where I'd be expecting him to be, certainly long term, to be predominantly an inside mid. That's where he plays his best footy. So you've got Tanner Brunn, so he's someone where he's mostly an inside mid, but he's sort of that goal-kicking mid. Good skills, pretty good ball winner. You can play him forward. I think probably to start his career, he'll play forward. And why I've listed him as an inside mid / utility, so with GWS, this is their thing. So you can have someone like a Toby Green who, as a junior, he was actually an elite mid, so that's where he played most of his footy. But then for GWS, with so many mids and not enough in the way of good general forwards, well, what that means is you've had a Green really play his career as a forward, and you could really say the same of Zach Williams in defence. Well, he was actually drafted as a mid. So there's, I guess, that risk factor with a Tanner where some might say you have him a bit earlier, but given that risk factor, yeah, look, I have him more in the middle part of this tier rather than top of this tier for that reason. So that's something to be mindful of, but I'd be hoping eventually he'd be getting more midfield opportunities potentially. So next up, so you've got a Reef McInnes. So here's someone where I don't expect to be seeing him necessarily early on for Collingwood. He'll take time to develop. He's that really tall midfielder. So he's your 1, roughly 92, thereabouts, and you can play him anywhere. So for Oakley, given how loaded their midfield was, he played a lot in defence, but you can play him forward. He'll be a marking target, and the hope will be long-term he'll be mostly an inside mid. So, but yeah, you would be thinking he might get thrown around given he has the versatility, being highly athletic, very quick for someone that height. So, yeah, and just really moves well. Very smooth mover. Just, yeah, looks really good on the ground. So, and he's someone who I think he'll be a terrific footballer, but probably doesn't quite necessarily have the scoring upside or the probability of being a high scorer of, I guess you could say, the guys in the tiers above. So, and then you've got a Jack Carroll. So here's someone where he might actually be the potentially even the highest scorer from this group, and his scoring could even be competitive with a Sam Berry, I would say. But given his draft position, look, it depends how much risk you want to take. And with Carroll, I thought absolutely he's worth that pick. Where did I have him? I had him here in my draft board, so he was 13th on my draft board. But yeah, I guess with Carlton, you just have to see, can he get those midfield minutes? I'd be hoping so, whether it's this year, next year. And he plays his best footy as an inside mid, really transforming from, I guess you could call him more that outside type back flanker into really a genuine inside mid with a very excellent sort of, I guess, contested side, and he brings that with sort of, I guess, the poise, composure. So he's someone where his game will translate superbly to fantasy football, and yeah, if things work out, he could really be in this tier with a Berry, not far behind these top 3, but I guess we have to see if he works out. So I've incorporated some of that risk into it just to, I guess, allow for those variances in, I guess, potential career outcome, but scoring upside, probably the highest from this tier and could even go up a tier. So it depends how much risk you want to take on. But yeah, Jack Carroll's someone I'd be very comfortable with picking, that's for sure. And much higher than where he was taken on draft day. So he could be one of those gems that a lot of people may not necessarily know about unless they're hardcore draft followers. So moving down the list, so now I'm into the next tier. So here I've got Archie Perkins. So he's someone where he looks at himself, no doubt, as being best suited as a mid. So as a junior, he was really splitting his time between, he played a lot of mid, but he was also playing quite a bit forward too. Is that sort of, I guess, strong marking type with a lot of weapons to him as well. So yeah, Perkins definitely has game, and I don't mean to really disrespect him by having him, I guess, this low in my power rankings from draft day, but it's really just, I guess, this whole tier, I could rate them pretty evenly, where I could make arguments for the likes of Berry, Powell, they could be up the top. I could have any of these guys in any order. And that's, I guess, the thing with this tier list, where it's really, I guess I've color-coded it very deliberately. So, yeah, that's sort of how I would work things, and I'd really try and get more, I guess, a pick that would be in the previous tier list rather than in the current one. And then I'd be happy to move down if I can get someone who would still be in that same tier, I suppose you could put it that way. But yeah, with the Perkins, yeah, look, he can play inside, outside, forward. I actually think he'd be best sort of in defence, honestly. And with all the players that Essendon are trying down back, I'm actually surprised that Perkins hasn't come up with all the, I guess, quite unusual names that haven't really played a lot of footy in defence, if any, a lot of them. So You'll have to wait to see there. But yeah, someone where I like the way he really takes on the game, is a really good ball user and can really penetrate as well by foot. So yeah, there's a lot there, a lot of weapons. So we'll have to see where he settles. But as a mid, he's not a huge accumulator, so that's why he's more so in this tier rather than the tier above for me. So yeah, he's someone I'd more than happily let someone else pick if they feel that he's better than that. So next up, I've got a Lazaro. So he's someone where very high volume accumulator, and it will be very interesting to see how he gets used for North Melbourne. So if his game is maximised and is being utilised as an inside midfielder, which to date is his best position and really the position he's shown he's got competence in, but he's got real scoring upside. So he could be probably not quite a Berry sort of scorer, but he could be with some of these guys. So he could be in that maybe nearing Haitley territory, maybe similar to a Tanner Brun here, so maybe similar to a Reef McGuinness, possibly a little better than a couple of these guys if things go right and is played the right way. But there is also the risk factor that maybe he's told to be a lockdown forward or a tagger. So that's the risk factor with a Lazaro, but nonetheless, I still do really like his game. So yeah, moving down from here. So now I'm getting into some tools. So, and obviously for fantasy purposes, you'll find the tools won't necessarily be as relevant, nor should they be, given they're not going to be finding much of the ball and they're not going to be scoring as well, generally speaking. So with a Thilthorpe, well, he's someone where you can play him key forward, you can play him ruck. What do Adelaide plan to do? Well, obviously they've got Riley O'Brien as their number one ruck, so I wouldn't be doing anything to change that. So I would be absolutely using Thilthorpe as mostly a key forward, but he can play those relieving minutes to give O'Brien a breather when he needs it. So that would be how I'd be looking to utilise him. But perhaps in the future, maybe way down the road, maybe when he hits his late 20s, maybe Adelaide might move him into the ruck. And for that reason, I've got him slightly above a Ugle-Hagan and a McDonald. So, and last year he was playing a lot of rucks, so you'll find if you look at his fantasy numbers from last year compared to, say, a Logan McDonald, even though they're playing sort of incomparable competitions where it's the Sandful at league level or the Waffle at league level, well, Thilthorpe's scoring was better because, well, he was playing a lot of ruck versus a McDonald who was a pure key forward. So, yeah, so they're the things to be mindful of, but yeah, only because of the potential ruck factor where maybe he gets asked to do that. Yeah, I've got him above. But then we move on to a Jamara. So, and here, why I've got, I guess, these two in particular here is due to probability of career. So I think they're, I guess, low risk of failure sort of picks, but obviously they don't have the scoring upside of the guys above. So they're the things to be mindful of there. But yeah, look, obviously being forward eligible, well, that's always a help. And with a Ugle-Hagan, well, he's got tremendous upside just as a footballer. So he's someone where certainly inside, and he'll be more of an inside 50 target, and I'd be expecting a number one option inside 50 at that. So yeah, you won't be, I wouldn't be expecting to see too much of him up the ground. Maybe a bit like a Buddy, he learns to push up the ground more, so maybe you get some of those components more so into his role than currently might be the case. So yeah, there's some things to be mindful of, and maybe there's some of the opportunities there. But yeah, so maybe there's some scoring upside. Maybe he gets some years where maybe he's nearing that 100 mark, but I wouldn't be expecting that often, and that'd have to be among his sort of better seasons, given key forwards don't do those sorts of things often. And then you've got a Logan McDonald. So you could look at him, so it depends on how he's used for Sydney ultimately. So is he going to be a closer to goal guy like maybe a Jeremy Cameron, or is he going to be forced more up the ground like a Nick Riewoldt, where he, I guess, can really use that elite endurance base? So we'll have to wait and see. He could certainly be a higher scorer than Jamara, but yeah, we'll have to see. These guys are interchangeable. Doesn't really matter who you pick and in which order. They're both going to be really good footballers, I'd be expecting at this stage. So, and these guys could be the two best key forwards in the competition, potentially, all going right. They'd be in that conversation, potentially. So, yeah, that's the sort of quality to look at there. But yeah, of course, the scoring upside isn't the same as these other guys. So next up, you've got a Joel Jeffrey, and he only just makes this tier on the condition that he's used as a general defender. If he's used in defence, maybe he could play a role a bit like a Nick Hayes, where he could be a legitimate intercept marking type in defence as that, I guess, medium to tall, sort of not quite key position, but someone who can really be, I guess, a threat down back as that interceptor. So for me, that's where Jeffrey plays his best footy, but what I'd be expecting probably early days is he's used more as a forward. So for me, it's all about role. If he's a forward, I'm not all that interested from a fantasy or Supercoach perspective. But in defence, that's really intriguing, particularly for Supercoach. If he's that, I guess, high volume interceptor, well, yeah, I'd be jumping on in a hurry if that's looking like his permanent role. I'd be comfortable taking him in this tier. And he's someone where I see his probability of career is pretty good as well. So with a Jeffrey, look, Gold Coast were fortunate to be able to pre-list him, so that's why probably a lot of people wouldn't know about him. He wasn't sort of, I guess, taken in the national draft so much as he was just, I guess, awarded to Gold Coast because they could take guys within their zone or that were academy picks for them, really, I guess, pre-draft. So that's sort of the story there with Jeffrey. But Jeffrey, had he been in the open draft, I'd say pretty likely he would have been a first round pick. So that's a bit of perspective on his game for those that don't know a lot about him. So next up, you've got a Braden Cook. So he's someone where at this stage he plays his best footy as a forward. He was averaging 2 goals a game this year in the SA under-18s. So very good sort of, I guess, medium forward, you could say. But he's also got the scope to be an outside mid. You could even have him running off halfback if you want him to. So there's some slight uncertainty about role, you could say, and best position. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But early days, I'd be suspecting he's probably a forward. So and he's a late bloomer, so don't expect immediate results, but give him a few years and I think he'll be a really good footballer. But for fantasy purposes, well, I don't see him going into centre bounces or anything, so I'm not seeing the scoring ceiling necessarily of some of the guys more in this territory. So yeah, this is probably for me about where I'd be open to taking a Braden Cook. Then you've got a Denver Granger Barras, so his scoring from a fantasy and Supercoach perspective to date's been underwhelming, and a lot of that's been down to roles. So he's someone where he's sort of a competitive type, good stopper, so that's not really what you want for fantasy football. But he's someone where he can be a really good intercept mark. So yeah, given you've got those capabilities, I think he will be someone who will improve over time, and he's someone where it's high probability of career that you're almost sort of taking him in this sort of range. So yes, I'd be open to him, but is someone where if someone else wants to pick him, say, in the top 20, well, I'd be telling him, go ahead, take him, because he doesn't have that same sort of necessarily scoring upside of a lot of guys. Given, I guess, he'll be quite, I guess, defensively orientated, but yeah, look, if you open him up to, I guess, play more of an intercepting focused role, and again, excellent interceptor can be a real intercept marking force, that's when he becomes more fantasy relevant. So we'll have to see how that works out. Then you've got a Nick Cox. So you're looking at a 2-meter specimen who can play anywhere. So he is looking like he'll play probably for Essendon as something like a tall wing. So that'll be a bit of a unique look, but I think that'll actually be a great look for him and a great opportunity because he's got the endurance base, certainly. He's got the skills. So as long as he can find enough of the footy there, well, then for me, he ticks those boxes and can be an option, particularly if his marking and contested marking can be a real weapon. So, but where else can we possibly see him? Well, you could play him as a key defender. He could be a general defender. Like, he's a good rebounder, good interceptor. So he doesn't have to play tall, even though he is 2 meters. So he's a really unique player compared to, I guess, what we have in the competition currently. And you can play him key forward. So there's lots of ways to use him. He seems most comfortable behind the ball, more so than in front of the ball as a forward. So that's sort of a bit of a general feel for his game. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he settles. But in terms of scoring upside, again, I don't see him having the ceiling of the previous tiers in terms of scoring. So have to wait and see. Zach Reed, in terms of scoring, look, he's a lower scorer, lower production guy than a Nick Cox, so that's something to be aware of. Certainly if he plays as a key defender, his scoring will be lower, but he's a good kick. He can intercept a little bit, so they're the things to be aware of. But his upside is more so from a fantasy and supercoach perspective if he develops more so into a ruck. So in Essendon's case, well, Sam Draper I think will be a terrific ruckman for a long time. So I believe that sort of futures against the odds unless Draper really, I guess, over the long run really struggles from an injury perspective. Then maybe a Zach Reid could become that ruckman long term. But yeah, for me, I'd be thinking he'll be a key defender as his probable position over the long term. So given that, I've got him quite a bit lower, but yeah, definite chances for career, obviously. In this stage, he'd be projecting as a future best 22 player. But with guys like Cox, Reid, they're not immediate players, even more so with Reid, so we'll have to see when they come in. But yeah, you've got a Tom Highmore, so he's someone where I'd be thinking for St Kilda, look, he can be a round one starter and he can actually be a really good scorer. So if you don't have him in your Supercoach or AFL fantasy teams, we'll put him in now, and I'd be starting him on my field personally. So yeah, I've got it right here. So he's an intercepting defender. That's what he does. He can rebound a little bit, good kick. He can provide a bit of run. So yeah, he's definitely someone who can play, and yeah, and he can play right away. So yeah, definitely watch him, and yeah, I think his scoring will be pretty reasonable, really, from the start. So yeah, you could make a case for him that maybe he's higher in this tier potentially. So yeah, it really depends on, I guess, your outlook for his career. He's a couple of years older, being a mature ager, so be mindful of that also. But age shouldn't really matter too much in the big scheme of things. And then you've got a Shannon Neal. So here's someone where he's here, I guess, out of speculation that, well, if he makes the grade, well, he's a ruckman, and ruckman can score pretty well. So, and yeah, and Neal I'd be looking at as among the more probable, given he's an elite endurance runner, late coming to footy, but he can play well enough. His upside could be something even like a Riley O'Brien. So if you really want to take a risk, you could take someone like a Neal, but he'll take a number of years to develop. So I guess it depends on how big your lists are in a keepers format, I suppose. So if you've got lists of 40 and you've got 18 teams, well, Neal is the sort of guy to bank, but yeah, don't expect to see him for quite a few years yet. So he's very much a development project at this point. So next up, I've got an Isaiah Winder. So he's someone where he can play mid, he can play back, he can play forward, you can do whatever you want with him. So whether he plays for West Coast this year, that'll be intriguing, but certainly in the WA under-18s, he was tearing it up, and then even at league level, he was showing some signs. So yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if we saw him this year, and given he's got some, I guess, utility value to play multiple positions, I think he can have a career, and I think his probability of career is a lot higher than people realise. He's been compared by some to almost a Sean Burgoyne, so although he's not that sort of well, it's not that level of player, but there's, I guess, hints of that, where with the way he moves, the skills, he has the contested ball winning, has the versatility. So yeah, he's someone where there's a lot to like, and I think that was a really good pick there by West Coast on draft day. So next we've got a Zane True. So he's someone where he's a pure inside mid, so you'll never have to worry about him playing anywhere else, or at least based on what he's done to date, that's the only area he's shown any real competency, I suppose. And what he is, well, he's just a pure contested ball winner, tackler, distributor by hand. That's his game. Doesn't have anything else to his game, needs to develop some more tricks. So yeah, maybe if West Coast are really stuck in the midfield, maybe he gets opportunities. But whether he has a career, look, we'll have to wait and see. He's someone where I guess he's in the higher scoring range from this tier. You could even move him up a tier if you think he'll have a career at AFL level. But yeah, for me, I just don't think the probability of career is high enough to necessarily, for the purposes of a draft, have him higher than where I do. So, and it's a similar story to an Alex Davies, where look, maybe he has a career. He's a higher probability of having a career than a Zane True. But yeah, look, tall mid, strong contested ball winner. But for me, there's a lack of composure element there, where I've got some doubts as to whether he'll be, I guess, a long-term best 22 midfielder for Gold Coast. So it's a bit of a wait and see. But again, upside, he could be high in this tier, could almost make this tier. And with a True, look, you could have him almost up here with these guys. I don't think he'll outscore a Carroll, but he could almost score like those guys if he was to become a best 22 player long term. Maybe he could, but I just don't think the probability of career long-term is high enough. Nathan O'Driscoll, so as I've got here, he can play mid, he can sort of run off halfback. So as a player, what does he bring to the table? Most aggressive tackler in this draft for me. Strong contested ball winner. He was playing a lot of waffle league footy, inconsistent for me, and a bit like a Davies, just his decision-making, ball use under pressure, just, I don't know. So whether he's that long-term best 22 player, we have to see, but he's certainly someone who has a crack, and given you've got the options to play mid, off, half-back, maybe he has a career and maybe he catches on, but we'll have to wait and see. Scoring could be sort of around here if he makes it, but given, I guess, my doubts that he is going to be that player, well, yeah, I've got him where I think is more appropriate. And similar story with a Caleb Porter in terms of probability of career. So tall mid, good numbers in the SA under 18s, or very good numbers actually in the SA under 18s, but yeah, I just have some doubts about his career, and specifically from the perspective of, well, his contested side, I don't love. He's someone where he really needs to attack the footy more and really be that hard ball winner. That's what he's lacking at this stage, and until he develops that, I'm quite skeptical of his game at this point. So, but yeah, he can certainly find the footy, showed that in the SA under 18s, and yeah, and he can play forward as well, strong mark, long kick, so he's got some weapons, he's a good athlete, so developable-ish, but he just needs to develop to be that player. So I wouldn't be expecting him to see him short term, and I think he'll take a few years to develop if he comes along. So a wait and see, but if he does come good, well, he could almost score nearing a Reef McGuinness maybe in this sort of territory. So yeah, so he's someone to be mindful of, but don't overpay, because the probability of career, I don't know, for me it's a bit shaky. And Eddie Ford, so he's someone where he was taken probably a bit later than he should have realistically, and he gives North Melbourne options. So he wants to play midfield in the future, and he does have midfield potential, but with so many midfielders for North Melbourne, does he end up playing as a midfielder? Well, there's some questions around that, but you can play him forward, you can play him back, so he gives you options. So it's a bit of a wait and see. So given the versatility, maybe he catches on and finds a role, and if he's a midfielder, he could score possibly okay, but he does have inconsistency issues, so he's a bit of a wait and see. If he's as a mid and his scoring is maximised, maybe he's sort of in this territory. Don't think he's quite in this tier, but a wait and see there. But yeah, if he's more of a, I guess, defender or forward, well, he's sort of where he should be, and that's probably what I'd be picking at this stage, because if you've got guys like Phillips, you've got guys like Powell, if you've got guys like Lazaro, well, if they all make it, well, it's going to be hard for Ford to get those midfield minutes that he may desire. So that's something to be mindful of. Brandon Walker, he's someone where I believe he should have gone quite a bit earlier than he did, and I think Fremantle got some value late. So someone where absolutely he provides a lot of drive from defence, very aggressive runner in terms of his run and carry. Kicking pretty good to my eye, and he can win his own ball. Maybe he's even got some midfield scope, but yeah, I think he's someone where he could become a piece, providing some drive out of defence. So be aware of him, not ultra high volume, but reasonable. So I think he can find enough to be fantasy relevant without necessarily being that, I guess you could say, 95 plus score in either format. So if you're happy with sort of, I guess, your maybe high 80s, maybe something like a Nathan Wilson sort of scoring, he'd be sort of a replacement for that type. Well, that's probably what you're looking at there if he makes the grade. So, and Errol Goulden, so a lot of people would say have him higher, and I certainly think from a short-term perspective, he'll be one of the more immediate guys, if he's selected, that is, for Sydney. And his role, well, he's an outside mid, he can play small forward. So I think of him more as an outside mid who can play across half forward. So I guess he's up the field where he could find enough of it, and he's got the endurance base, so, and he can obviously rack it up as well. So you've got some potential sort of scoring opportunities there, but very outside. Yeah, and just not sure he'll be that long-term best 22 player. So more someone to consider, probably I'd say more so for AFL Fantasy, given that outside type of game than Supercoach. But Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But he's got a possible chance at a career and he can rack it up. So, yeah, be mindful of him. You could possibly have him, let's say, with these sorts of guys for scoring in the long run. I don't think he'll ever be that sort of 100-plus scorer, even if he is sort of as an outside mid, realistically. But we'll have to wait and see. And similar with a Connor Downey. So he can find the footy again outside sort of mid. Could rebound off halfback given his weapons with his run and kick. Very penetrating kick. But yeah, for Supercoach, probably not as much. And look, with a Downey, I think there's a higher probability of career. I think he'll probably catch on for Hawthorn and be a piece. So yeah, look, maybe you could have him with some of these guys. But yeah, this is sort of where I've settled with him. And if someone else wanted him, by all means. But yeah, I don't think he'll ever be necessarily a premium scorer to be that excited about. And I think he's going to be more, I guess, a perpetual wing rather than rebounding defender, which also played a part in this ranking where, yeah, I just don't think he'll necessarily be that, I guess, guy you necessarily want with that ceiling for the purposes of Keepers League. And Oliver Henry, for me, it depends on role. If he's an intercepting defender, maybe you could move him up a little bit. If he's more of a medium marking forward, I don't really see the upside for fantasy or Supercoach purposes. Not an assured career. He's considered by a lot slightly better than his brother Jack for Geelong, but yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, no footy this year. Hard to judge those components. For me, picked earlier than he should have been. What I'd be looking to do from a Collingwood perspective, if I'm the Collingwood coach, I'm just lining him up with Jeremy Howe and saying, hey, learn off this guy, follow every move he does, try and become the next Jeremy Howe. So that's how I'd be looking at him and trying to develop him into a defender, because as a forward, I'm just not sure he has that upside to be great, but bit of a wait and see. And then you've got a Nick Stevens. So picked late by Geelong, but for me, he's got a bit of scoring upside and he's got a chance at a career. And early indications out of Geelong have actually been that he's off to a good start and could be a piece. So in terms of role, he can actually play a little bit through the midfield, but at this stage, he's more, I guess, that you could say that 190 centimetre-ish sort of rebounding defender predominantly is his main go. But yeah, he's definitely got scoring potential and probability of career. Look, he's got a chance. So, and where would his scoring be if things work out? Maybe in this sort of territory. I wouldn't really have him past this tier if things worked out. So, but again, with the colour coding, well, you could almost pick any of these guys in whichever order you like. I'd say have some flexibility with that, but I'd probably stick to as I have as this tier list. So from here, we move down another tier, so a Joel Weston. So you're looking at a small mid. He might possibly be playing some small forward for Fremantle, given, I guess, their front half is probably more so than their midfield, their area of, I guess, need or concern. So we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, very explosive, can rack it up. So there's some upside there. But yeah, being a smaller type, look, I'm not sure necessarily how much improvement there is. Usually with smaller types, they don't, if they're sort of the sub 180s, they don't tend to develop as much as the taller types. So we'll have to wait and see. Yeah, and look, scoring upside, I just don't ever see him as that 100-point scorer realistically. But yeah, someone where he's got a reasonable probability of career. I do see him some role-playing potential, and he can provide that burst out of stoppages. So he's an interesting player, at the very least, if nothing else. But yeah, there's a chance that he makes it. So definitely consider him, and yeah, consider him later in your draft, depending on how deep your draft goes, I suppose. Bailey Laurie, so I think he could possibly be playing for Melbourne as soon as this year, and you could say the same of Jake Bowie. So why did I pick Lowry sort of ahead? Even though he's more of a forward first, and I guess that almost helps, but I think his probability of career is slightly higher than a Bowie, whereas Bowie I see more as, I guess, that wing who maybe he pushes forward, so possibly he loses that forward eligibility. So look, a Bowie might have slightly higher scoring upside given it's more wing than forward, but yeah, I do think Lowry's the slightly better player, to be realistic. Just, I'd say probably, I don't know what it is, maybe is a better pressure player, maybe a little bit more in terms of composure and skill, but they're both sort of, I guess, good runners, have the skills, so pretty similar players there. But yeah, Lowry's slightly the better talent for me, despite the order they were picked in. Connor Stone, so he was a first rounder and a surprise first rounder. He's played most of his footy as a forward. There's some talk that there might be hopes that maybe he provides run-off half-back as a potential role. Maybe even pushing through the midfield was what some scouts were even talking about. I'm just not really seeing the upside in scoring. He can get hot as a forward, kick a few goals, but look, I haven't seen him up the field to be able to endorse him with any level of confidence. I think his probability of career is lower than quite a number of the players that I have above him, and I'm not really seeing that upside necessarily, wherever it is. Maybe as a runner-off halfback, maybe that's his best chance of getting a long-term role, but I'm just skeptical of him as a prospect more broadly. So, if you want to have him higher, by all means, but he's someone where, for the purposes of, I guess, a draft, I'd be letting someone else pick him personally. So, Jack Ginnivan, so he's someone where I'm reasonably optimistic given his draft position as to his chances of career. You can really play him anyway. He's played mostly as a forward, but you can play him through the mid, inside, outside. You can play him off half-back. Finds enough of it. He can win his own ball. Really good skills, moves well. I like his game. So I think he could possibly be a player for Collingwood over the long run. And for fantasy purposes, look, it'll be fascinating to see, I guess, where he ends up playing his career, which position it is, because he could end up anywhere potentially, and maybe that increases his chance of a career. So we'll have to wait and see there, but certainly in terms of upside, I don't see the upside of a lot of the guys in the previous tier, at least even if he does make it. So you don't have to prioritise him by any means. And then you've got a Mansell. So here's someone where I think he could possibly push for games for Richmond this year, depending on their injury situation. We'll have to wait and see. But look, he can shut down players. He can provide rebound. I think he was a really good pick through the preseason supplementary period, where it's you've got so many mature ages over the years, particularly mature age defenders, where their probability of career, even as rookies, late picks, it's very high and unusually high, and they can just sort of slot into roles and be pieces. And we might be seeing similar with a Mansell. So don't sleep on him. If you've got a late pick and you're looking for a defender and you're completely out of options, look, you could consider him later in the draft. I think that's a reasonable thing to do, even if he is those few years older. And then you've got a Jacob Weir. So for me, probably slightly lower, I guess, probability of career, but maybe similar scoring scope. And look, good user from defence, but I wouldn't necessarily say is a sure thing to make it for GWS. It really depends on injuries. Can they find other good defenders? So we'll have to wait and see there. But here's someone with a chance, so have him on your, I guess, extended draft board as sort of someone you could possibly be picking later. And then moving down here, so we've got I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Caruthers. So what he is basically a rebounding defender, outside mid, has wheels, can provide some drive by foot as well. So he's got those outside weapons, lacks the contested side of games. So by no means a high probability of career type, but someone who can at least generate drives. So maybe there's some scoring upside if he does catch on. So he's a name to at least be aware of in that much over the long run for a keepers league. But I wouldn't necessarily be buying him. He wouldn't be a priority by any means. I'd be taking the other guys first. And Carter Michael, similar sort of story where if things really worked out for him and he developed like crazy, look, maybe he's a Daniel Rich sort of successor. Is that, I guess, really penetrating kick from defence, good ball user, can generate that drive. I think that'll be Brisbane's vision with him if he is to develop. So watch for that. But again, probability of career, I would say, look, Brisbane's a good team. It's going to be hard for him to catch on. So we'll have to wait and see. Be aware at least. So, and then a Samson Ryan. So look, Richmond have a lot of good ruckmen, Soldo, Nankervis. A Coleman Jones, I think, is a good ruckman and has really been underused by Richmond. And then you've got a Mabior Chol, so he's played senior games as well. So it's going to be hard for a Samson Ryan to get games. I know Richmond's reports have been pretty positive and they've liked him. But for me, he's still pretty raw at this stage. Maybe he develops, but yeah, for me, it's sort of a shoulder shrug pick. Look, if you want a ruckman and you really want to take a chance on someone really deep in the draft that may develop, well, yeah, maybe you can take a risk, but I wouldn't be prioritising it. But yeah, look, with rucks, they score well, so if he does end up being a long-term player, cool, you can pick him earlier if you think that's the case. But yeah, I think it's going to be hard for Richmond to become that guy. So moving on, so you've got a Henry Smith. So what he is, he's a sort of ruck key forward, strong mark, so that's sort of his point of difference, sort of, I guess, by position. So, but he's not all that athletic, so he really needs to, I guess, improve, I guess, his running in particular, just become fitter, more athletic, so just develop more broadly. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But again, given he's a ruckman, look, if he develops, maybe he's worth more than this. But I guess you're just wishing and hoping, given basically he's not a high pick or necessarily someone who projects to be that long-term best 22 player as with Orion. Moving on, so you've got a Jack Saunders. So inside mid, has some potential. If he does get games, will he be that long-term player? Well, yeah, don't know. Hard to say. You're taking a chance, but look, late in the draft, at least he's someone where, look, maybe he's got some scoring upside. So you can consider that as a mid. And then you've got a Lachlan McNeil. So similar story, inside mid. He might end up being pushed forward, which is why I've got a general forward there. Just given, I guess, midfield spots will be hard to win. But yeah, look, you can have him on your board, but again, he's scoring. It'll be hard for him to get those midfield minutes and be that sort of, I guess, guy who's going to make the grades. So I've really gone down here, guys who are less likely to make the grades, but look, could still have some scoring upside. So that was really the focus with this list. Everyone for a Keepers League game needs some scoring upside. So I really wanted those guys here that have the capability to score. So I've left out all the lockdown types, the key position players that won't ever be relevant. I've really stuck exclusively with the guys who have some scoring upside for the long term. And then you've got a Luke Edwards. So son of Tyson, didn't want to join Adelaide, so he ended up going to West Coast. So yeah, look, you can play him off halfback, has the skills, not an athlete at all, and you can play him through the midfield, he can win it. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see how that works out. But yeah, probability of career again, look, you're not betting on him making it, so it's just really, I guess, you're taking a bit of a flyer. So yeah, that's my top 50. And before I finish, I thought I'd go through my subscriber goals of the preseason. So my first goal we just accomplished, so I've hit 700 subs, so thanks guys, much appreciated. And then my 750 subscriber goal, I'll release a sample rookie structure for AFL Fantasy and Supercoach. So I look forward to getting that out there and having some discussions around, I guess, those best rookie priced options. And I may even, as part of that video as well, do who I believe will be the best rookies and go through some of those and really do a complete team of rookies. So that might, I guess, give you some options and some guys to look out for during the preseason. And then from there, once I hit 800 subs, I'll release my AFL Fantasy team for 2021. So this will be the first time I've actually ever released my AFL Fantasy team to the public. So yeah, you might find some interesting and unique names in there. So definitely help me reach that goal. And same story for Supercoach. So when I hit 850 subs, I'll release my Supercoach team for 2021. So yeah, I'm hoping to share that one with you. And again, I've got some unique guys in and probably a few that you'd be expecting to see in there that might not make my cut. So yeah, hopefully we reach that 850 mark by the, I guess, end of the preseason and start of the season proper. So then I guess you guys can be set up for your teams for the year. Thanks guys for watching to the end, and make sure you like, subscribe and hit the notification bell for future updates. And let me know in the comments section below whether there's any future Keepers videos or any Supercoach or fantasy videos that you'd like in the future. And yeah, also let me know whether there's any players that I didn't include that you're interested to find out about, or if you want some, say, scoring ceilings on any particular players. I really just wanted to give an overview on the rankings, but yeah, if you want any projections or whether you think such and such player from this draft will be better than, say, someone established in the league. I'm happy to answer every and all of your questions regarding keepers, Supercoach, fantasy in the comment section below. So thanks guys, and see you in the next video.